Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to the annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signings, presented, of course, by Gettysburg National Military Park. And the Gettysburg Foundation, the official nonprofit partner of the National Parks at Gettysburg. We are pleased to collaborate with the Foundation to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts to participate in the Sacred Trust and share their unique perspective with our visitors during this special event to commemorate the anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Our next presenter today is Ranger Rich Condon. He will talk about the soil of our native state, Pittsburgh troops at Gettysburg. Pittsburgh and the surrounding environs of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, produced nearly 26,000 soldiers during the American Civil War. Many of these men served in the defense of their home state during the Gettysburg Campaign and forged an enduring bond to the landscape and each other for many years to come. Explore with Rich the stories of some of these Iron City natives who fought at Gettysburg and their long-lasting relationship with the battlefield. Rich Condon is a public historian from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. For over a decade, he has worked with a multitude of sites and organizations, including the Battle of Franklin Trust, Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall and Museum, Flight 93 National Memorial, Reconstruction Era National Historical Park, and currently Catoctin Mountain Park down in Thurmont. He has written for the Civil War Times Magazine, the American Battlefield Trust, as well as Emerging Civil War, and operates the Civil War Pittsburgh blog, which focuses on sharing stories related to Western Pennsylvania's role in the American Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Rich Condon.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for having me. First off, I want to thank Chris for the wonderful introduction. I want to thank Wayne, these two, for inviting me, and for Gettysburg Foundation and Gettysburg National Military Park for putting this on and having me today. This, in fact, is my first Gettysburg anniversary as a Gettysburg resident. It's been interesting. Before we get started, of course, I want to dedicate this special program on this anniversary week to two people, two ladies in the audience who are both fellow Yinzers. One is my fiance, Kim, fanning herself over there, and my mother, Cindy, who actually trekked from Pittsburgh this morning, the 3-hour drive to see this program. So, thank you. All right. So, real quick, how many of you are visiting Gettysburg for the first time? A couple of you? How many of you are visiting for the second time? The third time? The fourth? How many of you have been here more than 10 times? Okay. You live here. Yep. So I asked this question because there's got to be a reason we keep coming back to this battlefield, to this sacred space, right? Veterans, I think, have instilled this in us, as we'll see through some of the accounts that I use at their monument dedications, particularly on Pennsylvania Day in 1889, when a lot of these monuments on the commemorative landscape are dedicated. Why do we keep coming back? Is it, forming new memories with family? Is it trying to envision this hellish landscape during the Civil War turned into a peaceful haven where we kind of come to reflect? That's kind of what we're going to explore today. We'll be looking really at, what the battle and the battlefield meant to veterans who were here, and really inherently what it means to us. And of course, through the commemorative landscape. The case studies we're going to use today, of course, indicated by the title of this program, are men from Western Pennsylvania, specifically Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, which you might occasionally hear me refer to lovingly as Yinzers. And if you aren't familiar with what a Yinzer is, we bleed black and gold. This program really isn't going to go into the battlefield minutia. It's not really going into troop movements necessarily or the play-by-play of the Battle of Gettysburg, but really the stories we are telling here today are the human stories of the Battle of Gettysburg. And a lot of these are really fleshed out when the veterans return to the battlefield. And in many cases, when they return to the battlefield for the dedication of their monuments, which you see dotting the landscape today. So, before we get started, it's probably good to know that there were 69 regiments of infantry, 9 of cavalry, 7 batteries of artillery here at Gettysburg from Pennsylvania, an estimated 34,000 present. There's an estimated 5,000 men from Allegheny County in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that are here on the battlefield at Gettysburg. Unfortunately, we only have about an hour, so we're not going to go into all 5,000. So I kind of skimmed the top, and I picked a handful of stories that I want to share with you, and stories that were shared by the veterans themselves during these monument dedications here on the battlefield as well. But one in particular I want to start with is one that really kind of grabbed me at a pretty early age. I visited Gettysburg for the first time when I was about 11 years old. And one of the first monuments I'd seen was that of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves at the base of Little Round Top, kind of sitting there in the saddle between Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Well, this kind of sparked an interest that sent me on a weird journey where I ended up joining a reenacting unit, the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And, as you can see right here, on the right-hand side, there's a 12-year-old Richard holding a stick as a musket in front of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves Monument. And I was fortunate enough this last week as a resident of Gettysburg to visit this site again. And it looks great. The National Park Service has done an excellent job in preserving the landscape of Little Round Top. And if you visit today, there's a wonderful path that runs right past the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves Monument. But again, for me, this is where really the Civil War bug, or you could say the Gettysburg bug, had bit me. But when I was visiting at 12 years old, this site in the battlefield, I didn't really understand the full gravity of what happened here. I saw this monument you can see on the left-hand side, very somber looking, a soldier looking down, holding his gun. I didn't really understand what this meant at the time until I started really researching it as I got older. But a little bit of history about the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves at Gettysburg. As I mentioned, they're kind of caught in this saddle between the Round Tops where they actually sustained 5 casualties, 5 men wounded during the battle. Now, I think we look at a lot of units and we kind of judge them by the casualties they had taken in an engagement. We kind of assume that's a measurement of the action they saw here. We don't think about what happens afterward. And one story I wanted to relay was that of Sergeant Isaac McMunn, which during the monument dedication, his story is told by Sergeant Major A.P. Morrison of Company A of the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves. As the men on the night of July 2nd are hiding behind a stone wall here, kind of exchanging fire with Confederates across what is now the road that divides the two hills, Morrison said that McMunn held up his hand in token and stepped out from the protection of the wall of stone to carry a cup of water to a sorely wounded Confederate. And while bending over the body of the soldier, a rebel sharpshooter hidden in the treetop put a bullet through McMunn's face. This is one of the accounts of a man being wounded here in the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves. Now, McMunn survives this wound and eventually does go home. But what happens after this? Captain Robert Taggart of Company C, also known as the Iron City Guards, mentions during the monument dedication that it did not prove to be a fatal wound, but it would have been a blessing to our comrade had that bullet struck a vital spot. For who can measure the depth of pain and sorrow and mental anguish in which it plunged after his life after? at last dethroning reason and ending his life in self-destruction. Ultimately, Sergeant McMunn in 1888, so a year before the dedication of this monument, dies by suicide in the Ohio River in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Those are the stories we don't necessarily hear about when we see the 5 wounded on the monument for the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves. On Pennsylvania Day, September 11th, 1889, when this monument is dedicated, First Lieutenant L. Torrance noted, "More than a quarter of a century has passed away since we last stood here. Then angry clouds hung over our heads and the ground was convulsed under our feet with the shock of battle. But today the skies are peaceful and the sounds of war have ceased to reverberate among these hills. This monument, though beautiful in its proportions and workmanship, is of little intrinsic value. But who can estimate what it cost to lay the foundations for its erection? As we look upon it, we see and read much more than the simple and appropriate inscriptions it bears. It represents great sacrifices. Sacrifices so great they cannot be computed. Sacrifices, the cost of which lies outside the domain of any arithmetic. It represents the scattered graves of our comrades who died in defense of their country. Upon this loyal soil, the defiant army of treason under General Lee was defeated. Around the base of these round tops and upon the slopes of Cemetery and Culp's Hills broke the topmost wave of the Great Rebellion. 18 states were represented in the Army of the Potomac upon this famous field. And most appropriately, we find the Keystone State, everywhere present in the forefront of the battle, from its commencement to its close. During those 3 memorable days, her voice was never silent, and through cannon, musket, and saber, she spoke in defense of human rights and constitutional law with a power and eloquence that time will only glorify. May our beloved state glory in the record made by her chivalrous sons and perpetuate, not only in bronze and marble, but in the hearts of her children, their deeds of valor and sacrifice." So through this long excerpt that I chose from the monument dedication, they're quite literal with the purpose of erecting these monuments. It's to perpetuate the memory of what these men did here, not only for the dead, but also the living, but also passing the importance of what happened here down to future generations. And again, I think that kind of lends itself to why we continue to come here today. And you all are great examples of that. You know, we've come here more than 10 times, as has been shown. We also have the 61st Pennsylvania Infantry. By show of hands, how many of you have been to this monument on the battlefield? Okay. If you haven't found it yet, it's not easy. It's off Neal Avenue, or what's known as Lost Avenue. These guys are going to be posted on the far right of the Union line, near Wolf's Hill. As a whole, you know, these guys, kind of like the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves, didn't see a whole lot of action. They, at least in this particular engagement, is a part of the 6th Corps. They sustained pretty heavy casualties overall throughout the war. In fact, they're going to suffer 999 casualties in the 3 years that they're enlisted. Here, though, they're here the evening of July 2nd into early July 3rd, where they're going to exchange fire with members of the Stonewall Brigade. A lot of back and forth firing. During their monument dedication in 1888, Sergeant A.T. Brewer noted, "As representatives of the sovereign state on whose soil a conflict occurred, we have an interest more personal than historic. All other states concede to Pennsylvania a peculiar relation to Gettysburg. It was her territory which was moistened by so much precious blood. It was the only battle fought on free soil during the war, and the only great battle ever fought within the bounds of the Keystone State. To us, this atmosphere is perfumed with recollections of July 2nd and July 3rd, but how changed this scene? The same sun, indeed, shines in the heavens. Some of the same trees spread their green foliage over us. The same brook rolls its gentle flood at our feet, and the same rocks, hills, valleys, ravines greet our vision. The same Baltimore Pike stretches its white length before us, and the same Tawny Town and Emmitsburg roads wind through the same fertile farms and cragged glens. Still, the scene is different. Instead of deafening roar and din of a mighty conflict, all is peace and goodwill. But our minds and hearts are stirred no less than they were 25 years ago. And so again, I think this is one of those things that we try to achieve when visiting the battlefield of Gettysburg. It's quite hard to imagine two large lines of men crashing into each other on this beautiful landscape today. But that's what these veterans are trying to quantify when they're giving these speeches and dedicating these monuments on the Gettysburg battlefield commemorative landscape. And as you probably picked up, I'm going through these in numerical order, no particular order really. So next we have the 62nd Pennsylvania. Now these guys are pretty heavily engaged in the wheat field on July 2nd. In fact, they're going to be engaged in the Stony Hill, which you can kind of see in the background there, and the wheat field itself. Here at the battle, they're going to have 27 men killed, 107 wounded, and 40 missing and captured. Included in the 62nd Pennsylvania Infantry, you have members of the Espy family. And I see Colleen back there. If any of you know Tom McMillan, a descendant of Thomas Espy, there are 15 members of the Espy family in this regiment. I bring up the Espy post or the Espy family because they have a direct connection to Pittsburgh. And if you ever get a chance to go to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, specifically Carnegie, you can still visit a GAR post that is in excellently preserved condition, the Thomas Espy post number 153. So I thought I'd do a little plug for them today. So the 15 members of the Espy family, there's a couple other guys who are here that I want to talk about, and we're going to refer to them as the Jacobs. There's a couple of Jacobs that I wanted to mention, including Jacob Schweitzer, you can see on the right-hand side here. He lived in Pittsburgh for about 20 years before the outbreak of the war, originally from Fayette County, Pennsylvania, and actually owned a law practice in Pittsburgh. He originally is commander, or previously commander of the 62nd Pennsylvania, although here at Gettysburg, he's going to be commanding the brigade to which the 62nd is fighting with. On the left, maybe a lesser-known figure, a guy named Jacob Funk. And this photo comes from the Ken Turner collection. He actually has a really interesting account that he shares shortly after he's wounded here at Gettysburg in the wheat field. And this he's actually sending from the hospital. He said, "I came up to where some prisoners were that had been taken a short time before. The bullets were falling like hail, and the guard that had the prisoners ran and left the prisoners go when they immediately picked up guns and began to shoot at our men. I saw one pick up a gun, and looking round, he spied me with the colors of the old Keystone State. Immediately, he leveled his gun and ordered me to surrender my colors, or he would shoot me. But I thought that was a rather saucy demand, and I could not see the point. I took leg bail for security and increased the distance between him and me very fast. I had to jump a stone fence, which you can still see today, and came very near losing my balance, but I managed to get over. I then went straight ahead when directly I heard the report of a gun just behind me. I just concluded that was for me, and sure enough, the ball struck my arm 4 or 5 inches from the shoulder, passing under the bone and coming out in the chest near the armpit. I called out for someone to take the colors. One of the men ran out and took them, and I then made tracks to get out of farther danger. After leaving the battlefield, I went about 2 miles and then got my wound dressed." Funk does survive his wound that he receives in the wheat field at Gettysburg, but a little less than a year later, at Laurel Hill in Virginia in May of 1864, he's killed in action, and today is actually buried in Arlington Cemetery. The third Jacob we're going to talk about, Jacob Schenkel. Have any of you seen his picture before? I think he might be the most photographed Yinzer from the battlefield of Gettysburg. You can see him looking very alive on the left-hand side right there. Schenkel is serving in the 62nd Pennsylvania, just like the other two. And after the Battle of Gettysburg, he does not go with the regiment. In fact, he stays here in Gettysburg, working at Camp Letterman as a hospital steward. Schenkel is going to be there until November of 1863. And so, Schenkel also keeps a diary. In this diary, on November 11th, 1863, he notes that they took one scene of dead men and then his skirmishers, then his picket, when they went out over the battlefield with a photographer. The photographer turns out to be a local guy named Peter Weaver. And as I mentioned, there are several photos of Schenkel. Some of them where he's alive, pictured at Camp Letterman. Unfortunately, I don't have those here. But there's also this image on the right-hand side, which some of you may have seen before, taken across from Devil's Den. And if you look closely, this guy right here. So Schenkel and some of his comrades from Camp Letterman went out with Weaver over the battlefield in November of 63, posing as dead men. It's believed, and of course, that the intention was to produce these photographs and sell them during the National Cemetery dedication that month. Whether they did or not, ultimately, I'm not quite sure. After his service here on the Gettysburg battlefield and at Camp Letterman, Schenkel ultimately will head to Baltimore, where he rejoins his regiment, the 62nd Pennsylvania. Although originally from Pittsburgh, he eventually relocated to East Liverpool, Ohio, where he's buried today. All right, moving along. We got the 63rd Pennsylvania Infantry. Now, the 63rd Pennsylvania, primarily made up of men from western PA, a lot of guys from Allegheny County and Pittsburgh. Here at the battle is commanded by Major John Danks of Etna, not too far from where I grew up. And they're positioned approximately 300 yards south of the Sherfy farm. Here they have one man killed, Alexander Weichel, 31 wounded, and 4 missing. During the monument dedication, Captain Robert Nesbitt of Company A remembers arriving on the battlefield the evening of July 1st. He says, on the left of the Sherfy orchard, the members of the 63rd tore down the rail fences and built a rifle pit, facing the enemy across an oat field. Here we remained all night, pickets in the road, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, July 2nd, the enemy was discovered approaching with a long line of skirmishers. The commanding officers of the rebel line was now almost in front when the officer in command of the Union line gave the order to fire and kill the commanding of Longstreet's skirmish line. All fired and he fell dead in his tracks. So we held the line in our immediate front, firing at every head that showed above the oats. The 63rd Pennsylvania, of course, previously was commanded by probably a well-known figure a little bit further down the battlefield. One of my personal favorites, Alexander fighting Ellick Hayes. Hayes originally is from Franklin County, Pennsylvania, but had spent quite a bit of time prior to the war living in Pittsburgh, in Allegheny City, what is now Pittsburgh's north side. In fact, after a fairly prestigious career, graduating from West Point, serving in the Mexican-American War, he settles into civilian life and works for the Allegheny Valley Railroad. Serves as a civil engineer. In fact, today, for anybody who's familiar with Pittsburgh's north side, if you've ever gone to the Mexican War streets, which carry the name of various battles and leaders of the Mexican-American War, those are all laid out by Alexander Hayes. Hayes, however, with the start of the war, decides he needs to go to his other calling, which is to serve his country. And he re-enlists. He serves in the 12th Pennsylvania Infantry, and then eventually the 63rd. Here at Gettysburg, he's commanding a division of the 2nd Corps. He's going to be posted near Ziegler's Grove, and you can see that that monument to Hayes today, which was dedicated in 1915. My favorite thing about Hayes, though, is he keeps very detailed records of his accolades and the accolades of his men. There's some great resource material out there under the red patch, the regimental history of the 63rd Pennsylvania, as well as the life and letters of Alexander Hayes, which, if you've ever seen it, is about yay thick. It's a great doorstop, but chock full of information. And Hayes, in many letters to his wife home, talks about the actions here at Gettysburg. In fact, on July 4th, 1863, the day after Longstreet's assault along Cemetery Ridge, he said, "Yesterday was a warm one for us. The fight of my division was a perfect success. We're all sanguine after ridding our soil of the invaders." He elaborates a couple days later on July 7th. "Our fight with the rebels on the 3rd was the most terrific. Opposing me were A.P. Hill and George E. Pickett, besides several others of my old acquaintances. After cannonading us for an hour, they advanced across the plain and were met from behind our stone wall by a volley which swept them like a tornado. We took double our own number of prisoners, killed twice our own number, and took nearly 3,000 stand of arms. It is called the decisive Battle of Gettysburg. My defenses were stone walls. And since Jackson is dead, I think I have a just claim to his title. So from now on, we can call him Stonewall Hayes." And as I mentioned, years later, after his death in the wilderness in May of 1864, this monument is dedicated to him on the battlefield. Hayes, of course, today is buried in Allegheny Cemetery, just outside downtown Pittsburgh. Now, one of Hayes' biggest champions is David Shields. Of course, David Shields has a major part in writing the story of Alexander Hayes and sharing his story, not just after his death, years after the war into the 20th century. So he really helps shape the legend of Alexander Hayes as we move forward into the post-war years. He has an amazing account of Alexander Hayes and Hayes' division on July 3rd, 1863. After the repulse of Longstreet's assault, Shields mentioned they're flushed with the glory of victory and the exuberances of that great joy that comes with such a victory, looking upon the trophies of war. When the enemy were retreating in disorder and confusion, the general exclaimed, "Boys, give me a flag." They'd captured at least 20 stands of Confederate colors during the attack. The rebel color was handed to him. He then commanded his adjutant general, Captain George Courts, and myself, saying, "Get a flag, Courts, get a flag, Dave, and come on." We each took a flag, and the general immediately dropped his flag behind his horse and trailed it in the dust and blood of the battlefield. Captain Courts and I did likewise, and we started on the grandest ride men ever took. We rode down the whole front of the division. The men of the 3rd Division throwing their caps high in the air as we rode along, cheering lustily in their exuberance, showing their admiration for their glorious division commander, some men dancing in their delirium of their joy, others hugging their comrades in close embrace, with wild exultation of victory. All the time of this most exhilarating ride, the bullets of the sullen and defiant enemy came sputtering about us and overhead. These were the only moments in action I never felt fear. My horse seemed to be off the ground, traveling through the air. To General Hayes and the men of his division, these captured flags were but the emblems of disunion. He and the men under him could conceive of no better fate than to trample them underfoot and trail them in the dust as evidence of utter disdain, both for the flags themselves and the cause they represented. So Shields, of course, this moment had such a great impact on him that later on in the early 20th century, in 1910, he commissioned this painting, which you see below. Unfortunately, a high-quality version of this painting is impossible to find, as back in the 1920s, 1930s, it disappeared from the historical record. So somebody took it. Don't know where it is, unfortunately. But David Shields, you can see on the left here, pictured in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, his hometown. And on the right, you can see his final resting place which is here in Gettysburg in the National Cemetery, within eyesight of where he took his great ride with Alexander Hayes and George Courts. In fact, later on in the late 19th century, Shields is among those that will be on the Gettysburg Battlefield Commission. Sorry, I need readers now. All right. So one of my favorite monuments in the battlefield, which if you've trekked to the first day's battlefield, is the 74th Pennsylvania Infantry. It's part of the 11th Corps, comprised mostly of German immigrants. And what I think is truly interesting about this, too, is, if you talk to Pittsburghers and Philadelphians today, there's a bit of a divide, right? You have your Yinzers and your Johns, if you know the slang. So this is one of these interesting instances where you have guys from both sides of the state coming together in the 74th Pennsylvania, and they are pretty heavily engaged on July 1st. At the monument dedication in 1888, Adolf von Hartung, who is commanding the regiment at Gettysburg, who's wounded on July 1st, also reflects on this battlefield landscape and the importance of this monument that they've erected. And of course, on top of the monument, you can see what is depicted, their fallen color bearer, which is believed to be George Eckert of Germany. In yonder cemetery, thousands are slumbering the everlasting sleep, mowed down by hostile missiles. In honor of these dead, these monuments have been put up, but also to the survivors, part of the honor is due. One falls in the battle, the other dies afterward of the wounds or in consequence of the hardships of war. In former centuries, it was not customary to erect monuments for the living. It was left to the posterity to glorify the deeds of their ancestors. 18 years ago, Germany fought that gigantic war with France, and it is long ago since the finest of monuments rises on the Niederwald in honor of the dead as well as the living. So also is this monument. It is apparently a dead stone without language, but monuments speak a powerful language that warns and admonishes the living. Again, this speaks to another reason why we continue to come here today. Now, one of my favorite stories, though, from the 74th Pennsylvania is Peter Giebert, who you can see on the right-hand side here with his granddaughter sometime in the 1920s. Giebert is serving in Company F of the 74th Pennsylvania here at Gettysburg. Eventually will transfer to the Western Theater with the 77th Pennsylvania when his enlistment is up. And what makes this story so interesting is, he travels in 1913, 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, from Pittsburgh to Gettysburg. Not by train, not by wagon, but on foot. This guy's 70 years old and walks from Pittsburgh to Gettysburg about approximately 200 miles. He leaves on May 26, 1913. He will arrive here on June 13th. The entire way, of course, as a musician, he brings his drum. So in these towns along the way, places like Altoona, Cashtown, he's playing for money and he's funding his trek to Gettysburg and, of course, paying for his housing this way. I think a couple of years ago, a gentleman from Pittsburgh, and I'm blanking on his name right now, I want to say Jim Smith, had recreated this walk from Pittsburgh to Gettysburg, and I believe he was about the same age range. He might have had some car rides in between, though. He does an interview with the Altoona Times when he's about halfway to Gettysburg, and he says, "I've traveled considerably since the war in shows and circuses, always playing in bands, and have found it a great life, full of action and sometimes nearly as bad as fighting. But of later years, especially since the old soldiers began gathering together on 2 or 3 occasions, and since Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Hall was built in Pittsburgh, I've played several times there. My comrades in the Union Veteran Legion and Abe Patterson GAR Post all like music, and I try to please them whenever it's possible. I don't think I will play any more out of town, though." So we do know that when he does make it to Gettysburg for the 1913 reunion, he does play in what is known as Lincoln Square, is staying in the Gettysburg Hotel, and is here for roughly a month before he heads back home. He passes away a couple years later in 1933. All right. Another one of my favorite monuments, the 139th Pennsylvania Infantry along the J. Weichert Farm Lane, not too far from Little Round Top. You can actually see here I took a little trek on the right-hand side with a memorial ribbon. This actually came from a guy named Abraham Brown, who you can see pictured in the left-hand corner. He's a sergeant in the 139th Pennsylvania, and is here present during the battle and present during the monument dedication, September 11th, 1889, Pennsylvania Day. Later on, with a Pittsburgh newspaper, Brown delivers an interview where he kind of gives a brief synopsis of the 139th's action here at Gettysburg. He might be missing a few things, but this is how he describes it. He says, the 139th was ordered by Fred Collier, their commander, to hold their fire until they saw the whites of the enemy's eyes here in the farm lane. They did not have long to wait as the rebels came quickly. Colonel Collier yelled, there they are, boys, give it to them, which they did as fast as they could and fire. Each man expended about 10 rounds, which forced them to halt. The Reiter's regiment followed the retreating rebels on the morning of the 5th and passed over the ground, which was covered with the dead and dying. July 3rd, Collier himself is wounded in the foot, takes him out of action. But regardless, even though they saw a little bit of action here on the Weichert Farm Lane, this meant a lot to the veterans. Of course, they dedicate their monument here on the battlefield in 1889 with so many others. During the dedication, Captain William Herbert of the 139th notes that Pennsylvania had been invaded, and the heart of every Keystone lad was eager to assist in driving the invader from her soil. All night we marched, and when we reached the Pennsylvania state line, a hearty cheer passed along the lines, and caps were waved in the air. We were in our own state again. And he continues along. It has been often said that republics are ungrateful, but the sentiment is not true. Our presence here today on the battlefield in such large numbers testifies to the contrary. Through the love and appreciation which the loyal citizens of the great Commonwealth bear toward her sons, who were her defenders when her soil was invaded, we have been summoned to meet once more in this sacred spot, where so many hundreds and thousands of our brave comrades laid their lives upon the altar of their country. We are here to join in the dedication of these scores of beautiful tablets and monuments which a great state has provided and set up as a lasting memorial in honor of the noble dead, as well as a tribute to the survivors of the regiments who helped drive the invader from her borders. Let's get a cheer for Hamptons Battery. Yeah, Hamptons Battery F. If you've ever been to Pittsburgh's north side, or Allegheny Commons Park, you can see an almost identical sculpture right there along Cedar Avenue. You can see it on the right-hand side, which was actually erected in 1871 before the battlefield monument. Here at the Battle of Gettysburg, they are fighting in the Peach Orchard. They're consolidated with Thompson's Battery right next to them. They were consolidated not too long before the Battle of Gettysburg. Here during the fight, they lost 7 killed and mortally wounded, 11 wounded, and 18 horses lost in the action. The unit also lays claim to the only Allegheny County native to receive the Medal of Honor for actions here at Gettysburg, Casper Carlisle. His Medal of Honor citation, which is written by Thompson in his after-action report, states that he assisted to disengage the traces of the dead lead horses under a heavy musket fire, and he mounted the wheel horses and took the gun off the field thereby saving it. Eventually, in 1893, he is going to receive the Medal of Honor for his actions here at Gettysburg. There's a second monument to them, and I don't believe I have a photo of it here. But near the Pennsylvania Monument, the position that they held on July 3rd along Cemetery Ridge is also marked. Not too far away from there, you could say the men of Hamptons Battery have 3 monuments, one of them being a little bit more natural. That's the Hamptons Battery rock you see in the center there, which veterans, when they came to the battlefield to dedicate the monument near the Pennsylvania Monument, visited this site, and they actually photographed it several times, mentioning that the wounded of their regiment were stationed behind this big rock, which basically looks like one boulder stacked on top of another boulder. And these men sought refuge behind this rock. So this is the photos taken in September 1889 during the other monument dedication. And of course, after they visited this other monument, they go to the peach orchard to pick out the location for the previous monument you saw before. The 2 men pictured on either side, Lieutenant Joseph Todd and Joseph Miller, are both killed or mortally wounded here in action, and their names are etched in stone in the Pittsburgh Monument in the north side. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Knapp's Battery. Of course, they don't see a whole lot of action. They are engaged on Culp's Hill and Powers Hill. You can see that on the left-hand side there, the monuments on to Knapp's Battery on Culp's Hill. And on the right-hand side, this photograph is taken outside Sharpsburg after the Battle of Antietam in 1862. So you can kind of get an idea of what a full-size battery looks like. And last but not least, we have the 155th Pennsylvania Infantry. A lot of these guys are from Allegheny County, a lot of them from Pittsburgh, but they're also a bit scattered throughout western Pennsylvania. They're going to be engaged on Little Round Top, where you can see their monument right there, where they lose 6 killed, 17 wounded, and 1 missing. This monument, the original base, dedicated September 17th, 1886. And just 3 years later, in 1889, when they received funds from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they erect the zewab that you see atop the monument today. One of the key players who's kind of really critical to the erection of the 155th monument, and even the Pennsylvania monument you see there, is Charles F. McKenna, who, during the fight here at Gettysburg, serving as a private, he sees one of his good friends, one of his messmates, mortally wounded during the fighting, who he takes to the rear. He'll come here years later, serving, just like David Shields, as part of the Gettysburg Battlefield Commission. So he has quite a bit of influence in kind of shaping the commemorative landscape here on the Gettysburg battlefield. You can see on the left-hand side what's supposed to be a wartime photo of McKenna. What's interesting is if you ever look at the regimental history of the 155th Pennsylvania, called Under the Maltese Cross, they do a lot of Photoshop, which is kind of cool for the early 20th century. If you look at the photo, his face is actually taken from a civilian photo and just kind of posted over a zewab. They did this with a lot of guys. It's pretty impressive, actually. You can barely tell. On the right-hand side, we see McKenna much later in life. This is around the time of the 50th anniversary, and we see him pictured. Do you guys know who that guy is on the right-hand side? Does it look familiar? Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So this is them standing in front of the Pennsylvania Monument. This photo actually hangs in Pittsburgh at the Soldiers and Sailors Memorial and Museum. Excuse me, but of course, McKenna, like I said, is part of the Gettysburg Battlefield Commission, has a big hand in kind of serving as a steward on the battlefield landscape and for the Pennsylvania Monument that we see today. During the 1886 dedication of the 155th Monument, McKenna is present. And he notes in his brief speech that these early tributes can be of no service to the dead, but they form lasting records of deeds held honorable among men, and are strong incentives to noble acts in the present, and mark a steady progress toward that better condition which is the ultimate destiny of the human race. Of course, we can see here the photo on the right-hand side comes from the regimental history under the Maltese Cross, where we can see them dedicating on September 17th, 1886, the base for their monument on Little Round Top. Of course, you see it's missing the zouave there. Henry McKenna is a little to the right of the shaft up there. Of course, as I mentioned, when they get funds from the state of Pennsylvania, 3 years later, in 1889, they rededicate their monument with the zouave atop the base. And there's a really striking and powerful speech given by John Kerr, who's serving as a sergeant in the regiment during the Battle of Gettysburg. And you can see him pictured on the left-hand side right there. This is actually where the title of this program comes from. I think this speech really kind of encapsulates the feeling of these soldiers when they're coming home from war, returning to Pittsburgh, returning to Allegheny County, but also recognizing what this means in long term for future generations. He says, "How striking the contrast which this peaceful landscape presents to the terrible scenes and the bloody drama of war enacted here. Yonder heights are no longer crowned with hostile cannon. These valleys below us no longer reverberate with the roar of the conflict. No longer are the groans of the dying mingled with the shouts of victory. Everything around us betokens peace, where before was heard the rumble and grumble and roar of war. In the providence of God, a goodly number have been permitted to come here today to take part in this, perhaps the last public act of the regiment on earth." So as we're moving toward the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century, these men are recognizing that their time is limited. This is the lasting token they're leaving here on the battlefield. He continued, "We did not choose, we found ourselves in the ranks. For the bugle call at that day was the reveille of liberty. It awoke the hardy mountain men of the Alleghenies, and they dropped the axe to grasp the rifle. It was heard by the stalwart boatmen of the Ohio and the Monongahela, and they gathered on the fields that drank the blood of Braddock, and marshaled under the shadow of Fort Duquesne, and from the city and the country, from the hills and the valleys of western Pennsylvania, the boys in their teens and the men of maturer years rallied and joined together in the quick-forming ranks of war. The 155th came out of the war with 28 battles inscribed upon its flag. With what pride did we join in the triumphal march through the streets of the nation's capital? With what beating hearts and swelling patriotism did we tread on the soil of our native state? With what a thrill of joy did we behold again the ascending smoke from the factories of our native city and see again our homes rising in the distance? With what proud step did we march down our familiar streets, bearing aloft our torn and tattered banners amid the shouts and huzzas of victory? We surrender this monument into the keeping of the loyal Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, in the hope that built of imperishable granite it may endure forever. But should it too crumble beneath the obliterating touch of time, and the record carved upon its tablets be effaced, and every letter and the inscriptions be lost, this historic mountain will stand as an everlasting monument." And I wanted to end on this note in particular because, as I mentioned, as a newish Gettysburg resident, I'm fortunate enough that I was able to see Little Round Top being unveiled last week for the first time in a year and a half or so. I think the National Park Service has done an amazing job with restoring that landscape. And if you visit today, unfortunately I didn't fit it in here because I did submit these slides before the opening. But if you get a chance to go up there, you can go today to the 155th Monument, which, if you've been up there before, was a little bit inaccessible. But now there's actually a trail leading right up to where John Kerr and McKenna left these remarks in the 1880s on this everlasting monument, Little Round Top. So I want to thank you all so much for sticking with me and enduring the heat. if there are any questions, I'm happy to stick around and answer them as well. Thank you.
All right, a couple announcements before we all get underway. It has been decided with the heat index in the danger zone. Now we will hold the last two programs of the afternoon inside in the Ford room. Inside in the Ford room. You'll have to go through security. Now, listen, I wasn't in favor of this. I think you ought to be out there like the Civil War soldiers. I'm not making you wear wool, but the whole staff was going to rebel, Chris, if we didn't do something over this. So we'll be in the Ford room beginning at 1:30 with our speaker, Richard Hatcher. Please feel free to get something to eat, get yourself hydrated. And if you haven't seen the pop-up temporary exhibit in the foyer on Little Round Top, with the artifacts found on Little Round Top, make sure you see that. And A Rough Course Life, our exhibit, which went up about a year or so ago. If you haven't seen that, get a ticket and go in and look at it. We've got some great things inside the building. So I appreciate Richard, appreciate all of you. And as always, Wayne Motz's commercial. If you want to help with these programs, you want to help us help the National Park Service preserve Gettysburg, stop at the Friends desk. They would love to make you a member if you aren't a member, everyone. And if you are, they would love to upgrade your membership. How does that sound? All right. You have a good afternoon. We look forward to seeing you.